Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at CUNY's Graduate School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation this evening. If you're not familiar with the Gotham Center, as always, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, hundreds of event recordings, dozens of podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. And those of you looking for a more interpersonal experience can, of course, check out our online educational program for adults, Gotham Ed, offering many courses by leading experts at gothamed.com. Those courses are going up shortly. Tonight, as part of our regular series featuring some of the best and most interesting new research on New York City's history, we'll be discussing this new book from Sarah Gronningsater, The Rising Generation, Gradual Abolition, Black Legal Culture, and the Making of National Freedom. The business of defeating slavery was, of course, a national effort that involved arduous lobbying by thousands of actors, white and black, from the 1750s into the early 1860s. And like most things, if not all things, it was a local story that required sustained activism from the everyday level of the home and the street to courts and legislatures. But not all states were equally important. New York had an outsized role because it was the largest state in the Union and therefore had great electoral weight nationally in the winner-take-all model of American democracy. As our guest tonight writes, until New York abolished slavery, it was a swing state. And the act which finally abolished slavery in New York in 1827, the result of at least 3 generations of lobbying, linked the North together as a wholly distinct region of freedom against the much expanded slavery South and the new pivotal West, which of course sped America's drive to the Civil War. For the history of anti-slavery, New York is also exceptional because it saw the largest emancipation on U.S. soil before 1863. The state had by far the largest population of slaves in the North, and was therefore very, very nearly the last to end the practice, but it was also home to the greatest number of free Black Americans, particularly in New York City, with 80% of the enslaved in New York State living on small farms or in a few huge estates in the lower Hudson Valley, especially, and other regions like Long Island. As we heard recently in our conversation with Michael Duma about his new book challenging a lot of the conventional history about slavery in New York, those farmers, and especially the wealthy landlords of Dutch descent, were crucial to slavery's expansion after the Revolution in New York, when states began curtailing the business. Tonight, we'll hear the other side of the story, looking closely at the figures who ultimately bested the champions of slavery in New York, in particular the first generation of the emancipated, that generation of Black children born into quasi-freedom in the first decades of the 1800s. In a broad sense, it was these people who brought an end to slavery in the United States. Their names are debatably some of the most famous in that history. And while most historians dwell, understandably enough, on the high-level action that brought on the Civil War and Reconstruction, without these so-called ordinary figures featured in Gronningsater's book, those events most likely would have never occurred. I won't say any more, but allow me to briefly introduce our guests and we'll get started. Sarah Gronningsater is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where she works at the intersection of legal, political, and social history in 18th and 19th century America. She's the author of several essays in professional journals and edited monograph collections detailing the research presented in her first book, The Rising Generation. That work has also received a number of prizes and fellowships, including awards from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic and the American Society for Legal History. She was a Barra postdoctoral fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and was an Andrew Mellon Foundation Fellow at the New York Historical Society. In 2020, she was also awarded the Richard Dunn Award for Distinguished Teaching, and in 2023, earned the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching by the Penn Friars Senior Society. She received her AB from Harvard University, an MST from the University of Oxford, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. I'm delighted to finally welcome her to the Gotham Center. I'm thrilled as well that we could have Kelly Carter Jackson join us as moderator this evening. Sorry, Kelly. Kelly is associate professor and chair of the Africana Studies Department at Wellesley College and the author of the Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, a winner of the James Broussard Best First Book Prize, and a finalist for the Museum of African American History Stone Prize. Her essays have been published in the Times, in the Post, the Atlantic, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, basically any outlet you can imagine. She has been featured in numerous documentaries and interviewed for a wide range of news companies and podcasts. She's the executive producer and host of the award-winning You Get a Podcast, the study of the Queen of Talk with Leah Rigor, and co-host of This Day in Political Esoteric History with Jody Avernon and Nicole Hemmer. From 2021 to 2024, she also served as historian in residence for the Museum of African American History in Boston, and she is the head of the Massachusetts Historical Commission. So I'm thrilled to have her this evening as well. We're going to get started in a minute, but just one last piece of housekeeping. As usual, the chat and hand-raising functions in Zoom have been disabled out of respect to our speakers. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to do that at any point in the next hour. We'll begin answering those questions around 7:15 or so. So with that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming our guests with the usual bit of silent applause.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Peter. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening. And I want to give a particularly big thanks to Kelly Carter-Jackson for agreeing to do this with me. She's the first person I thought of as who I wanted to be in conversation with. And I just want to say really briefly, she does have her own beautiful new book out. You can actually see the painting, I think, behind her, called We Resist. And I think Kelly, honestly, was the reason some of you probably came tonight, as you saw her name on the event. And I think many people know her as an incredible historian of 19th century African American history and abolitionism. But I want to say one other quick thing about her that may not be as obvious, and I think you'll immediately understand why I wanted her to be the person interviewing me tonight. I went to a great book talk that Kelly gave for her new book a couple of months ago. And the person sitting next to me was one of Kelly's former students who had been one of her students at Wellesley and was now had a job in New York City, but had traveled that evening to see her former professor give a book talk. And listening to this young woman talk about sort of her professor and why she decided to major in history and African-American studies is I think you're going to see, for those of you who haven't seen that side of Kelly, how she's the kind of person who would have students sort of clamoring to be in her classes and to learn this history. And so I'm particularly grateful for someone who's able to ask questions and get all sorts of kinds of people to think about these questions as the person who's joining me tonight. So extra thank you, Kelly. So before I turn it over to Kelly to start sort of, asking me about the book and having a conversation, I did want to just make sure everyone sort of understood what this book was about really quickly. So I am going to share a few slides with all of you. And here we go. So here we go. I'm going to start the beginning. Okay. So the book is called The Rising Generation, Gradual Abolition, Black Legal Culture, and the Making of National Freedom. And I want to sort of give you the main argument of this book. It is about the generation of Black children who were born between the 1790s and 1830s in New York. And the argument in the biggest level is how this generation helped make national freedom in the 1860s and 1870s. And if I can give you what I hope is one of the main payoffs of the book, I'm going to actually move you all the way to the very end of the book where I talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I titled this last chapter, The Great Question of Equality Before the Law. That phrase actually comes from one of Frederick Douglass's newspapers, because I wanted to make an argument about how this generation actually made this great question of equality before the law a key question in politics, in legal life, in the public sphere at this big moment of national emancipation. So I think for many people, when we think of the words emancipation or freedom or civil rights or equality before the law, we reasonably think about the Civil War era and Reconstruction, or maybe we think about the 20th century civil rights movement. But my argument in the book is that that moment itself, that big national moment, is actually informed by the activism, the labor, the decades of effort by this earlier generation of New Yorkers. And just a quick reminder that Frederick Douglass himself is born in Maryland. He escapes to Massachusetts, but he eventually settles in upstate New York. So he himself actually is one of the New Yorkers that I'm interested in my book. As Peter was gesturing to in his introduction, New York deserves focus because it was the most politically powerful state in the New York, in the Union. And there was a proverb at the time sort of referencing its swing stateness that, quote, as New York goes, so goes the Union. So in some ways, this is the best audience to sort of argue that New York is really important. I'm talking to probably, a bunch of people who signed up to a Gotham Center seminar. But sort of for people who are skeptical of why do we need a whole book about New York and this Black generation who grew up there, it's because New York, among other things, nothing happens in the 19th century without New York's electoral votes. It's a finance capital, it's a cultural capital, it's a legal capital. So as New York goes, so goes the Union. As a quick reminder as well, if I sort of started us at the very end chronologically of the book, and Peter so helpfully gestured to this in the introduction, slavery was really important to colonial New York. It is deeply embedded in the colony of New York's political economy. There are 19,000 people enslaved in New York on the eve of the American Revolution. If you note, that's even more people than were enslaved in Georgia. So sort of the notion that there was this like free North from the beginning just doesn't hold up. And so I think that's another important part of the story, is just thinking about the fact that there was slavery in the North and people had to work really hard to dismantle it. So my book's argument in a nutshell: New York State is particularly important to the history of emancipation in the United States. Not just famous people like Frederick Douglass, but thousands of ordinary Black New Yorkers, and especially this generation of Black children born after the American Revolution. And my last slide, just for this little introductory set of remarks, I'm sorry, I lied, 2 slides. Is one, this sort of argument about when we think about the most famous amendments to our Constitution in the 19th century that abolish slavery, that give citizenship to people born in the United States, grants equal protection under the law, and gives men the right to vote regardless of color, that these are actually amendments that make all the more sense if you understand this earlier emancipation process in the North. So every single one of these amendments, I argue by the end of the book, is informed by the activism and the efforts of this generation of Black children. And it's the last thing I'll say is that it's actually important to understand how this generation became free. In 1799, New York passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. It's a state law. And what it says is that children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th of 1799 would be considered free at birth, but they would have to work as servants for their mother's masters until they were in their 20s. So it's this odd law that says you're technically born free, but you're immediately put in the position of, it's sort of akin to being an indentured servant. It's akin to being a laborer first forced to work under traditional poor laws. And so initially, these children's lives don't look very different than what it would be like under slavery, but there's a consciousness that they're going to be free as adults, and they get certain rights because of this servant status under the law that they use to their advantage. So I'm going to end there, but I hope those prefatory remarks gave a sense of what I'm trying to do in the book and set us up for what I know is going to be a really good conversation with Kelly. So thank you.
That was great. That was really, really good. I love a good setup. First, let me say thank you. Thank you to the Gotham Center. Thank you to CUNY for putting all of this together. I appreciate any organization that will give historians a platform, that will give us leverage when we write these books. We spend a lot of time writing our books, and so it's always a treat to have people that want to engage with your work and that show up to hear and to listen and to learn. And so I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful for Sarah. Like, Sarah and I go way back. I can't even say how long now, but and I just know, like, I'm so thrilled and happy for you because I know how hard it is to write a book. I know how hard it is when you've been sitting with a topic, with a story for years, and you've been trying to get it out, and to see it here in the flesh is like, it's like a newborn baby. You know what I mean? It's very exciting. And I was joking with Sarah earlier, but a little truthful too. Like, I was saying that I have done these talks twice before, once with Ilyan Wu, and right after that with Jacqueline Jones, and both of them won the Pulitzer Prize. So I was like, I feel like I'm a good luck charm. Like, I hope this book wins all of the awards because it's just so deserving. And I really appreciated this book because I feel like there's a wave of scholarship that's been coming out, I would say maybe even in the past 2 to 5 years, very recent, where you have like Kate Mazur's work and you have Chris Bonner's work and you have Van Gogh's work and all of this scholarship about how we should sort of rethink the North, how we should rethink sort of slavery in the North and free Black people in the North and their efforts to really create the rights that we all enjoy when we think of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Like that's free Black people, particularly in New York, doing this work. So my first question to you is, I love a good origin story. So I want to know, like, did this project find you? Did you find this project? Like, how did you come to this story, and how did you get to this place of the rising generation?
Um, can everyone now see why everyone wants to be in Professor Jackson's class? Like, um, so I mean, there is, I think, a pretty clear origin story to this. So before I went to get my PhD, I was a high school teacher. And I think that there's a part of me that has just always been so interested in young people and how they think. And what's amazing about, and in the 19th century, they wouldn't have called them teenagers, but what we call teenagers is they're like old enough to have really sophisticated thoughts, but they're young enough that they still have like ideals and they want it, like they're like, they don't have caution yet, which is also what makes them scary. But like, so I guess I would say in some ways, I've always been interested in young people and how their sort of politics come to be. And because of that, when I went to grad school, I knew I wanted to work on African American history. I went to work with Tom Holt, who's a really wonderful scholar of Reconstruction in the United States, but also emancipation in Jamaica and the West Indies. And so I said I've had that sort of broad sense, but I didn't actually know much. I mean, and this is where, Kelly, your question is so good. Like, I didn't know much about slavery in the North. I did not know about gradual emancipation. I think like back when I was in grad school, which was years ago now, it was not big in the public consciousness. The wonderful historian of slavery and emancipation in New York, Leslie Harris,
Yeah,
had
yeah,
like
yeah.
only just recently done a big exhibit with Ira Berlin, another important historian at the New York Historical Society, just called Slavery in New York, because it just hadn't much been sort of part of public conversation, and even honestly scholarly conversation as much as it should have been. So when I was in grad school and I found out that there was this thing called gradual abolition, where children were born into a different status than their parents, it like immediately clicked as like, this is a research question that I could spend years on. What might it mean to be a mother and give birth to a child, and the mother's enslaved, but your child is of a different status? What does that do to sort of family like politics, to the ways you can protect and not protect your children, to children's experiences of having like older members of their family like maybe sold away from them? And then what is this sort of the gender? And in some ways, the book is also about the parents of the children of gradual abolition. And so I sort of, those were my sort of, and that was the initial set of research questions. And the last thing I'll sort of say in answering this, you were so right, Kelly, just thinking historiographically, is this book is in conversation with people like Chris Bonners, Kate Mazur, Van Goghs, I think Martha Jones, sort of looking at citizenship in Baltimore, like even sort of in it, and obviously that's like a sort of a, well, I guess it was technically a border state in the Civil War, but Maryland, unlike those other states, did not abolish slavery before the Civil War. It's this wave of new scholarship that's been really interested in how free Black people engage with formal law and politics. I think that's one of the things that links, and I think that was more of the surprise when the research started. I didn't actually start thinking of myself as a legal historian, and then I realized I couldn't tell the story of this generation I was so interested without then becoming a legal historian, like Bonner, like Martha Jones, like Kate Mazur, like Goss, where like you're actually like, what's the Whig Party doing? Like, what's federalism? Like, you know, what's this state Supreme Court case? And then that sort of, I just, this generation, it mattered too much to them, and so like I had to become an expert in that.
Yeah. I mean, I can see you teaching at law school. It's like, because there's so many legal cases. There's so many ways in which Black people are taking to the courts to sue their masters. And there's just so much rich history. And I wanted to sort of return back to New York for a little bit, because I think in people's popular imagination, we think of New York as a free state. And it was I can't remember, years ago, when I think it was the New York Historical Society that did that whole like exhibit on slavery in New York, sort of blew people's mind that like 1 out of 5 people were enslaved. I read a book not too long ago that talked about how New York City tried to secede with the South when the Civil War happened. And it's like, wow, New York is economically and politically invested in slavery. And I wanted to know if you could talk about that in the context of Black New Yorkers. Like, what does New York look like and feel like to them? Because I think we think of New York City as the safe haven. It's the first place that Frederick Douglass runs to when he gets freedom. It's the place where David Ruggles is doing all of this abolitionist work. And then you read The Rising Generation, and there's so many stories of violence and of just how horrific slavery is. And you start to forget, like, this is New York. This is not Charleston, South Carolina. This is New York. So paint us a picture of like what New York is and why it matters so much. You kind of sort of set the stakes when you first started speaking, but like for Black New Yorkers, it's an interesting place to think of New York as a border state, right?
Totally. I mean, these are just all the greatest questions. I mean, I'll think about, I want to start with like one quote from someone in the book. So this is actually someone who's coming from a slave state further south, Austin Seward, and he moves to upstate New York, and he eventually writes an autobiography. But he has a line in it where he says, I found it just as hard to be beat over the head by a piece of iron in New York as I did back in Maryland, right? Like his point is like this idea that somehow it's like less cruel or more benign, or that slavery is somehow not as awful in New York. He's like, it's terrible everywhere, right? And all of the things you can imagine. I mean, you like mentioned Charleston, like are happening in New York State. And I think actually to answer your question too about what does it feel like for Black people, there are certain things that I think are sort of universal, right? Like one of the things that's interesting about and why I really wanted to focus on both like rural and urban areas is a lot of the state laws, they're state laws, right? So like there's those laws apply in far up in the Adirondacks, they apply on the sort of along the Erie Canal, they apply down in New York City. And yet at the same time, there are sort of like specificity depending where you are locally in New York. And Kelly, to your point, like New York City it's a place where you're going to find slave catchers because it's a port city.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to see, I mean, particularly in my
Kidnappings.
Yes, kidnappings, and particularly if you think about kidnapping, even in the origin of the word, it's children, right? Like
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
easier. There are absolutely adult men who are kidnapped, but among the most vulnerable are going to be young people who like physically can't protect themselves in the same way.
Yeah.
They might not sort of, like if you're tricking a child. I
Yep.
think women are also vulnerable for similar reasons. And so the reason why you have people like David Ruggles, who you mentioned, David Ruggles, create something called the Vigilance Society, and they literally have to be vigilant for
Yeah.
all the ways you could be put back into slavery. And I think New York City, particularly, it's a tricky place for this because it's a finance capital. So it's a place where you have Southern slave owners want to bring enslaved people to New York City when they travel there. New York City's banks have deep interest in the cotton economy, right? So New York City it's an interesting place in some ways. It's a place where it's the first stop on the Underground Railroad for a lot of people. It can actually be a port into
Yeah.
freedom, and it can also reverse direction, right?
Totally.
Yeah,
Totally.
literally reverse direction. And then there's parts like, I don't want to paint any part of New York as somehow some perfect egalitarian place, but by the time you get to the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, what historians call the burnt over district, like in northwestern New York, and this is where Frederick Douglass moves. It's where
Yep.
Seneca Falls happens in the 1840s,
Yeah.
women's rights. It's this sort of like it's a place where radicalism is,
Yeah. Syracuse, Rochester.
Syracuse, Rochester, Utica, all of those places. I mean, that's where you get really strong anti-slavery and feminist politics. And so there are parts of New York, if you're a Black person, where you might be like, I'm gonna just skip this New York City thing and maybe go to Syracuse, Rochester. It's also frankly closer to Canada, where if you really need to get out of town, you want to be near that border.
Yeah. It's so funny too how like how the history of regions have reversed. Now it's like you see Black people in cities and less in these more like Western parts of the state because they don't feel safe anymore. And cities have become that like enclave. Like Okay, so this book is for all those who are going to read it. It is deeply, deeply researched. Like I was taking a lot of notes. I do this weird thing where I look at people's notes. You have like 80 pages of notes. Like it is. I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much in this book, and you're writing about children, and that's a huge challenge. You're writing not just about children, but you're writing about the legal system, the court system, how children are sort of petitioning the courts. And I wondered if you could, there's a lot of legal documents that you're going through, a lot of legal documents. And I wonder if you can talk about the challenges in that, because a lot of scholars I have found don't actually write about children, because it's so much easier to write about adults. And a lot of the people you're writing about, of course, are adults, but we're children, like during slavery, so it's complicated, but they're telling their story as children and as adults. But we don't do a lot of investigating the lives of youth and the trauma that children face from slavery and the challenges that children in this quasi-freedom apprenticeship world face. And so I wanted to know if you could talk about like the challenges in your research, like how hard was it to find this, these sort of smoking guns, if you will. And I don't know if there's any advice you could give to people who want to pursue, similar work, looking at legal history and dealing with children.
Yeah, I mean, I have God, I have so many things I want to say about this.
Say it all, say it all.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm gonna try to be concise. I mean, one actually is just also remember that in the 19th century, particularly because of sort of life expectancy, like so many like adults, I mean, people die more in the 19th century, right? I mean, there's like epidemic disease, we don't have antibiotics, no one understands how yellow fever spreads, etc. The reason I'm bringing up that point is I think we should always be interested in the history of children. But in the 19th century, sometimes children were like 50% of the population, right? Like if you think about it, like people aren't living till they're 80. So like to not study children is actually to miss like large portions of like any sort of group of people in the 19th century. So that's just like I think like a first point to make. I think because sometimes I think that sort of the history of children and childhood seems like this little niche thing, and it's like no, it's like all the people. Like, and then what of course becomes difficult is when particularly you're talking about enslaved children or children, the servant children. They're not exactly the children who are like getting to write long diary entries in their safe bed at night, right? So it's like, how do we like capture their experience and their voices? And that's where some of the court records did become very useful. And these are these are unpublished sources, and you sit there and you like go through the microfilm and you're like, what am I doing with my life? And then you like, I opened the book with this one, this girl who was stuck in she just was, I mean, I probably found her in the archives like 12 years ago. Her name's Charlotte.
Charlotte, yeah.
And Charlotte is brought into court because she's accused of burning her master's house down. And she's asked a whole set of questions. I mean, she's literally interrogated, and you can't really see my hands, but it's a very long interrogation. Yeah. And she's asked, are you free or not? And there's a couple of sort of questions back and forth where she explains that she is not a slave. She knows she's going to be free. And she says, and they say, how long do you have to work for this master? And she said, until I'm a big woman. Yeah. There's something about that language. I'm like, you could imagine a child saying that, right? Until I'm a big woman. And she may not know all the technicalities of the law, but I think I found enough moments.
Or even how old she is.
Even how old she is. Well, Kelly, I'm so glad you mentioned that too, actually, for two reasons. One is I always, when I've taught Frederick Douglass's autobiography over the years, I always sort of ask students to think about how he begins his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And he begins by saying, I don't know my birthday. Yeah. That it's even like a simple privilege of being like a free child is that, your birthday is written in a family Bible, whatever it is, and I think so in some ways, a hallmark of slavery is not necessarily even knowing those sort of basic things about yourself. And what's interesting about that 1799 law is these children born after July 4, 1799, if their masters follow the law, and they don't always, but if they do, and a lot of them did, and these are also the records that I look at, they had to file birth certificates for these children. And so a lot of the records I looked at were these like unpublished records in town clerks' offices registering the birth of a child under this law. And I think it's maybe symbolic, but way that they're slowly moving out of slavery, and it is gradual, right? It's called gradual abolition, is actually there's a record of when they're born.
Yeah.
So I also just think about again, and on the other hand, like masters cheated, and let's say like you might not know the town clerk has that record, but these are, I hope, and I mean again, I could talk about this forever, and I'm going to stop myself, but those are some of the things I was sort of like thinking about, and some of the ways in the archives I was able to find out some things about these children.
Yeah, the story, I mean, you opened the book with that story, and I was just like, oh my gosh. And the fact that she burns his house down is also something like, I think about like the acts of resistance, the acts of resiliency, the endurance that it takes. Like these children know they have a ticking time clock. One of the stories I'm going to read, like this one passage, it's on page 81, and it's a familiar story of Sojourner Truth. And in it, to me, like time and the passage of time and how long people have to wait, and sort of the knowing yet not knowing of that is so much a part of this story. And so in this one, it says, the 1817 law, significant though it was, did not end slavery overnight. A decade was a painfully long time for those forced to wait. Sojourner Truth later recalled through a heartbreaking dialogue in her autobiography what it felt like in 1817 to know that freedom was still 10 years away. Truth told her father, an enslaved man who did not live with her, that all the slaves in the state would be freed in 10 years, and that then she would come and take care of him. Her father replied, I cannot live that long. His daughter begged, oh, Daddy, do live, and I will take good care of you. Truth's father did not live long after this conversation. He died enslaved. And when I read that story, I was like, oh gosh, like it just, there's so much there that is just, it's so human and so gut wrenching when you realize that, and for a lot of enslaved people, they are competing against the clock. They are competing against time. They're trying to just make it to 1827. They're trying to just make it to adulthood, in which you just talked about how hard it is to survive adulthood. It wasn't guaranteed that you would live a long life. And these stories are just so powerful. So I wanted to know if you could talk about that as well. Like, what did, a lot of these people that you're talking about, they have such grit and resilience. And even in the face of insurmountable odds, they are still challenging the system. They are still seeking out justice. And really not just for themselves, but for their entire family. And if you could just talk about that.
Kelly, first off, you read that so beautifully and poignantly, and it's
You
funny.
wrote it.
Yeah.
You wrote it.
But it's fun, like that. That's actually like that. It's, to me, it's actually one of the stories in the book that like I actually like occasionally have gone back and I read it, and it's like it gives me like the worst kind of goosebumps all over again. And I think like one thing that I think about Sojourner Truth, and I've sort of, and actually Kelly, you and I have talked about this over the years too, is like I do worry sometimes that like, and I know I'm like quoting you back to you, but you're like, there's allowed to be like 3 Black Americans in the 19th century, right? It's like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, maybe Sojourner Truth, right? And they are so extraordinary, and I like, they should be on everyone's lips all the time, and they should be studied and read. But part of what I wanted to do with Sojourner Truth is actually sort of make the point that in terms of her experience in gradual abolition in New York, this is happening to thousands of families. Like in this one way, she's actually not special, right? Which like how many families and who didn't end up writing narratives are facing the exact same thing that she was facing. And I think also you're sort of about the point about time, right? And I think that's where I find, I think, and I really actually, if Kelly, if you're willing, I'd love to throw this question back to you, but I wanted to say sort of what the question is you as a historian, sometimes you want to have a certain distance from the people that you write about, like they lived 200 years ago, they saw the world differently. I can't be in their shoes. And you also sort of want to, I guess like the question of objectivity with historians is always a tricky one. We're always talking about how objective can you be, like you just follow the evidence. But to your point, I spent like over 10 years of my life researching this generation, and I remain just so astounded by their grit and resilience, right? I mean, like, the setbacks or the delays. And they say this, like, as this generation gets older and they start writing newspapers and they give speeches and so we do get sort of direct meditations.
Yeah.
there's this one petition campaign that I talk about in the 1830s, because when this generation becomes adult, they start petitioning the state legislature for stronger anti-slavery laws. And
Hmm.
there's one particular time where they're in the middle of a petition campaign, and I think it's Peter Vogel saying, and he said something like, "Look, he's like, we may not get it this year." He's like, but
Yeah.
if we fail this year, he's like, we're gonna do it next year and next year
Yeah.
and next
Yeah.
year. And I'm just like, I don't like, and so there is something I admire the people in this book so much
Hmm. Hmm.
going, and they keep going in the face of nightmare.
Yes.
And so I just actually, if you don't mind, just because like you and I we're both sort of historians of 19th century abolitionism, like I'm wondering how you think about that question with the people who you write
Yeah.
about.
I mean, I think about this because like I think there is something about knowing that you were born free. I'm putting that in quotes because they're actually not born free, but that gives you a sense of entitlement about what you deserve or what you should have and when you should have it. That whereas for their parents, for their grandparents who are born into generations of slavery and there's no hope and you're born a slave, you die a slave, that's it. This generation is special in the sense that they're like, no, 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 this is coming for me, and we're going to take it, and we're not going to stop there, and we're not satisfied with just freedom. Like, we want rights, we want voting rights, we want land, we want protection, we want, there is just a sense of entitlement there. And I don't use the word entitlement like in a negative way. I mean it like an expectation of and I think that expectation is really what fuels their activism. I mean, these aren't people that sort of just get freedom and then like go away. Like these are people that freedom fuels them to not just want it for themselves, but to want it for everyone and to try to like expand their activism even more, which is why I don't think it's a coincidence that you see like Rochester and Syracuse and Ithaca and all of this, and even New York City, like this hotbed of activism. It makes sense to me. I think that why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, it really is such a pleasure being in conversation with you, because also, I mean, this because you like write these books, you make these arguments, and you're like, I hope that it's so wonderful to see how people then read you, like especially when
Mhm.
it's like, and I feel like you're reading the work the way I hope that it's like being read, and I think that is sort of this argument about it's it's in some ways the story of 19th century like slavery is a really dismal one, and particularly because it's like expanding across the nation this time period, and it takes it's like
Yeah.
setback after setback, and like, and also I think to your point earlier that like even when good things happen, like there's a good law passed, like there's still also just the toll of this, right? Like
Mhm.
maybe you're free when you're in your late 20s, but like the girl Charlotte who burns down her master's house, it's because she was getting beaten, right? Like the
Yeah.
violence, it's like
Yeah.
in some ways I'm like, I hope she like went on and got everything she deserved, but
Yeah.
she doesn't get an easy childhood back, right?
No.
And yet I do think there's something of this generation where um they are born expecting something different as their life goes on.
Mhm.
And I think the other point that you sort of made, it's not just that they want better for themselves, which they do, is there's a
Mhm.
real sense of like collective obligation and responsibility, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
going to do
Yeah.
it for everyone in New York State. Like, that's why they want to change state laws. And then they're quite explicit. They're like, we're going to fix New York, and then we're going to fix the rest of the country, right? They're like, and that's why, like, I love it when emancipation, slavery does end in New York in 1827, on July 4th, 1827. And um, there are sort of across the country, like free Black people sort of, there's like, we have records of they'll sort of raise a toast to New York. And so New York becomes
Mhm.
very aware of itself as like, we did this here. It can happen in other places. And then it also, they're in conversation with free Black and enslaved people across the country who look to
Yeah.
New York and see what's possible. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think there's something about that dynamic that I was hoping to capture in the book. And I feel like,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, you
yeah,
did. You
yeah,
did.
yeah,
You
good.
did. I love that. I want to I have a lot more questions to ask, but I want to be mindful of time. Okay, I did want to ask about the Lemon slave case in 1852 because I was familiar with that story a little bit, but then in reading your book I was like, "Oh, snap. I didn't realize just how high those stakes were and like the outcome of the court case. Can you tell, for people who are not familiar, the story of the Lemon family, like what happens to them and what are the stakes and how it's like, how it's peddled out in the North, how it's peddled in the South? Like there's a lot there.
Yes. Okay. So hopefully in the last half an hour or so, I've convinced you, the audience, that this is a particularly remarkable generation, and then they're particularly knowledgeable about law and politics. And so this chapter, which is the 6th chapter, it's sort of leading to the Civil War, is about this case called the Lemon case. And the Lemons were a white family from Virginia, and they wanted to move to Texas with 8 enslaved people who they owned, and they wanted to basically like build a cotton plantation in Texas. But the quickest way for them to get to Texas is actually to first go through New York City. So they leave Virginia, they take a boat up to New York City, and their plan is to just get on another boat right away and go to New Orleans and then to Texas, right? It's like catching a connecting flight at O'Hare.
Yeah.
That's the plan. However, many of us have done that. They get to New York City. And one of these children of gradual abolition, who's now a grown-up, he's now a middle-aged man, but he was born in New York under gradual abolition. His name is Louis Napoleon. And he's basically alerted to the fact that a Black steward on the boat had asked these 8 enslaved people, it's 2 young mothers and their children, right? So I think that's also, again, like there's like, these are 2 women in their 20s and their children, and it is such a risk actually to say you have freedom, right? Like your masters are with you, these people trying to take you to Texas. And they tell, basically sort of through this little like underground railroad network, they arrive in New York and they get word to Louis Napoleon, this Black New Yorker, that they'd like to be free. And so Louis Napoleon then petitions for a writ of habeas corpus from a local judge. And, habeas corpus bring up the body, and the judge grants the writ and says, these 8 enslaved people have to be in my courtroom tomorrow morning. And the white Lemons are like, what is going on? Like, how all of a sudden are my enslaved people in court? And through this very dramatic trial, it is heavily covered in the press. The judge frees these 8 people. And it becomes a national controversy. How dare New York do this? They've taken the property of Southerners. Virginia actually funds the appeal in New York's higher courts. And long story short, it becomes like Lincoln talks about it on the campaign trail. When South Carolina secedes from the Union, South Carolina writes this whole list of here's all the reasons we're leaving the Union. And they list the fact that New York courts had done this. And I think to me, the big payoff there is like just sort of conceptually is, okay, fine, South Carolina's mad at New York. We kind of knew that. But what I don't think people sort of fully understood is like they're mad at New York because this generation of people, these Black New Yorkers, had made it the business of the courts to do this. And so if you want to think about the outbreak of the Civil War, to me, without understanding this generation's legal and political activism, there's parts of the Civil War breaking out when it does that don't make sense. So the Lemon case, I could speak for hours on it, but I hope that was a good nutshell.
No, that was good. That was good. I know. Okay, I'm hoping I can get to 2 more questions quickly before I know we're supposed to start opening it up to the audience. I want to tell, so in your epilogue, I'm going to skip forward. You tell the story of 2 Charlottes. You mentioned the first Charlotte that opens up the story, the young girl basically takes her master to court. But then there is Charles Ray's daughter, Charlotte Ray, who is this empowered young Black woman who's going to Howard University for law school. And I was like, wait a second. Like the breakneck sort of speed at which you get an enslaved woman named Charlotte, who's fighting this case in like it's maybe 1811 or something. Yeah. And then you have fast forward 50 or so years, and you have this woman named Charlotte who's in law school, and her father writes to her, this is Charles Ray's daughter, he writes in a letter to Garrett Smith, he says, "You are aware that my daughter Charlotte is a law student at Howard University." And then he also talks about like how she's a good student and how her professors like think highly of her. And then there's even like a picture of her is it like her law license or like her like passing the bar? And then it's just like it has her attorney and counselor at law, Charlotte Ray. And I'm like, I had no idea who this woman is. I also love finding out about people I didn't know about. And I wonder how much that is a testament, like the existence of Charlotte Ray, attorney at law, is a symptom or a product of Charlotte, who don't, there's no relation. They don't know each other. But I think about the resilience that's coming from this community, the activism that's coming from this community makes it possible for someone to say, I'm not just going to challenge the law. I'm going to like become the law. I'm going to become a lawyer. Like it just felt very full circle. I wonder if you could just speak to that and to the person that she is.
Yeah, I mean, it was the very end of writing the book where I wrote that epilogue.
And it's the perfect, the two Charlottes, it's perfect. Like
Charlottes,
chef's
and I was
kiss
just like,
how you
well,
ended the book.
as a writer, and I know Kelly, you're an amazing writer too. As a writer, you're like, thank you for both being named Charlotte, right? Like, but it's
poetic.
It's poetic, and it's just a beautiful name. And you know, I think in some ways I want to like have a healthy dose of skepticism that like the law doesn't fix everything, right? And in some ways, Kelly, your own work shows this, right? There are times when like, first off, the law can do evil things, or the law's not enough, or the law's not followed, or the law feels inaccessible. And so I don't want to overly romanticize the law, but I do think so Charlotte, the lawyer, I mean, she's the daughter of Charles Ray, who was a Black abolitionist and politician, and also was the editor of one of the major Black newspapers before the Civil War. And her father's own newspaper was constantly talking about the law, right? Like talking to readers about, here are the laws that protect your rights, here are the laws we need to fix. It is the law is constantly in conversation. And I really want to stress, and I think this is why it was important to start the book with Charlotte, it's not just among elites, right? Like, you read stories where it'll be like, a church was filled on Sunday with hundreds of people, and one of the things the minister talked about was this new law, right? So this is like, many people have understandings of the law within this generation. And I think they do have, first, they know how the law operates. I mean, they are incredibly sophisticated in their legal knowledge. And I think they do have there is a faith that the law can do good things. And I don't want to paint like too much of a rose, and I've been asked,
I know what you're saying,
like, yes, yeah, and like in doing this work too, like it's a question I've gotten from audiences of like, the law is not always a silver bullet, and like courts don't always do the things you want. But I think empirically, I think the evidence does show that this particular generation and these households, right, like Charlotte's the daughter of Charles, that there was a sense that the law could be used for good things and for possibility.
I mean, that's what Napoleon does with the lemon cake, right? It's like, the law is on our side. You're in New York, we can get you free. Like, this is the law is on our side. Okay, last question. I promise to open up. And I stole this from Tamika Nunley, who is also brilliant and legal scholar too, looks at the law a lot. She was giving a talk and she said to me, well, not to me, she said to the whole group she was talking to, she said, all authors just want to be read. All authors just want to be read, that we write to be read. And I was like, oh man, that's absolutely true. And not just we write to be read, but we write to give these stories voice and volume and value. Like the people that we're often writing about are sort of silenced and have been erased from a lot of textbooks. And there's ongoing struggles right now to like keep us from learning this valuable history. And I want you to be able to give this audience like your takeaway. Like, what is it that you want readers to take away from the rising generation? If there's one thing you could tell them, one thing, here is the moral of the story. If you get nothing else, get this. Like, what would you say?
First off, I love that, and it's truly want to be read.
Yes.
I think if I were going to pick one, and it's hard not to make this sound cheesy, but I believe it sincerely, is that I think ordinary people matter. And when I say ordinary, I don't mean, I don't mean like you're not special, but I mean like people who aren't congressmen or presidents or people who write big books. The people who like sort of drive the change in my book, a lot of them are ordinary people. And And I think what I wanted to do in the book was draw, and in some ways, this is the part of me that like is a former high school teacher. Like it's almost like I'm teaching grammar, where I'm like, we are going to pound home this. I'm going to draw these lines for you. It is not going to be
Yeah.
hard to see what the lines are. Like
Yeah.
the lines between like, ordinary men trying to vote in rural areas, and their actions do make it to the U.S. Congress, partly because they elect people to the U.S. Congress, but also just
Yes.
that like democracies survive when ordinary people make the democracy work. And
Yes.
democracies don't work without ordinary, like they just don't, like they can't, they don't like it. So I think that's one of the big takeaways. Is
That's huge
yeah,
because, like,
yeah.
I mean, I feel like this is the lesson that we need today. And especially in a moment where a lot of people feel disempowered, or they feel like the system is rigged, or they feel like only if you're a billionaire do you really get to have a say. Like, to show that, like, no, it's ordinary people that we necessarily haven't even heard of before. And maybe you only have enough material to write a few pages on them, or a chapter on them. That to me is some of the most inspiring history that I've read in a really long time, because it gives me a roadmap, or like a blueprint from, like, okay, if they could do this in the 19th century, what more can we do in our own current political and economic circumstances? So thank you so much for this work. We want to leave. I don't want to take up too much time. I want to leave time for questions. If there are any questions, we'll take some. Yes.
So we have a question from Linda Maria Grasso. How did this generation become knowledgeable about the law? Was it primarily through families, through education, through the church, newspapers, oral tradition? What were the spheres of education? What were the spheres in which this education was taking place?
So in some ways I would say it's actually all of the above, all of the things that you asked in your questions, but I'll give sort of one answer that stems from research in the book that also was just, I mean, I think one of the fun things that authors get to talk about when they write a book is sort of what surprised them, or like what generally they did not expect to see in the research. And there's a whole chapter in the book about schools. And there's this and for this audience in particular, there's this famous school called the African Free School. It starts in New York City in the 1780s. It's enormously important and educates thousands of Black children over the course of several decades, including some very famous people like Henry Highland Garnett, Alexander Crummell, James McCune Smith. But what I actually was surprised by is how much schools are also opening across the state, including in some quite rural areas. And it's partly because New York State, at the same rough time period that this generation was coming of age, New York State is setting up its first public school system. They called them common schools, not public schools. And it's slow and it's patchwork. But the state legislature begins offering funds for local districts to open schools. And I found more Black children in school in sort of rural areas or smaller cities. And also part of the ways these schools are opening is just, again, like the labor and care of Black elders, right? Like parents, ministers who are saying, we're only getting, we're not getting enough funds from the local city council, but we're going to literally like have bake sales, right? Or do other things to raise money to pay for a teacher. But so I think that was one place where I saw children sort of learning to think about the law and their role as citizens at quite young ages. I mean, I think like going, I'm sitting here with like master historians, like we're always sort of careful, I think, when you do 19th century to not sort of like draw straight lines between the past to the present, there's a whole 20th century in the middle, right? But I think one thing that, I think if there's a constant, it's the potential of public schools for civic education. And schools as literal town squares for communities. So one of the things that you also see happening in these schools is sometimes like children would go during the day, they go to school as children do. And then there'd be night schools, right? Like maybe there's like an older generation who wasn't able to go to school as children, but they want to learn how to read or to hear the local news. And so the schools are also important just as sort of physical structures where there can be sort of consciousness raising in the community about law and politics. So it again, to answer the question directly, it's all the things listed, but I would just say from sort of the widespreadness of schooling, there was more of it than I thought there'd be.
Yeah, and you had a line in that chapter, I think, where you were talking about how it can seem from our point of view as if it's sort of not as high stakes as emancipation, right? But what's coming out inevitably from pushing these questions about just education. And you talk about at one point how folks are petitioning to and actually succeed in getting the New York State legislature to agree that Black children have to sort of be given a certain amount of education at some point, right, in the story.
Yeah.
All of that sort of entails questions of citizenship, right? And everything that goes along with that. And that produces inevitably kind of this backlash effect where you noted at some other point in the book about how you can sort of track in newspapers how there's a sort of noted distinction between the earlier and later part of the story, and there are 1800s before the Civil War, where it was common around the time of the Revolution to talk about citizens, and now you see more and more talk about inhabitants and these other sorts of things to try to create this sense of like the hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
That goes even above the hierarchy within those who are considered free. I'm going to remind everybody that we've got just a little bit of, we're going to be a little short on time today, but if you have questions, please send those in. We have another question from Marilyn Stern, although this would be fine because then I'll just pepper you with questions if we come up short. Marilyn Stern asks, were the enslaved going to school?
So mostly enslaved children were not going to school. What's interesting is that when the African Free School is started by this sort of elite white abolitionist society in the 1780s, in their rules, they actually say that they will educate enslaved children. And I think to sort of incentivize masters to send enslaved children to school, they sort of say, well, like waive tuition. So there may have been a small number of enslaved children who went to school, but for the most part, no. And so again, like the ways in which freedom takes a long time to be full-fledged and real. But, and Peter mentioned this, one of the things that both Black and white New Yorkers fight for is for this generation who are born after 1799, there's an insistence that they receive some education. So I had mentioned that that law is, the gradual abolition law is initially passed in 1799. And in 1810, due to the voting of Black men who voted in quite high numbers at this time period, and the efforts of white anti-slavery lawmakers, there is an amendment passed saying that all children born after the 1799 law have to receive at least some schooling in local common schools, or they can be educated in their households. But it's an interesting example of the way, and this is Peter's getting to, that there's actually compulsory education of this rising generation. It's one of the other ways in which they're different than their parents. And what's really interesting is if masters don't abide by the law, those children are allowed to actually petition to be released from their servitude early. And so there is evidence. You'll see sort of older teenagers or people in their young 20s sort of getting before lawyers and courts or like justice of the peace and saying, hey, there's this 1810 law. I was supposed to go to school.
Charlotte says that. Charlotte says that in her case. They asked Charlotte, have you been educated? Can you read? They ask her, can you read? And she's like, no.
Yes, yes. And so, and the fact, I think that exchange is like, it tells us of so many important things. One is all the children who, like, again, laws are only useful if they're put into practice, right? So many children still maybe did not get taught to read. And yet on the other hand, I think that the district attorney was asking that precisely because there were a number of children this time period who were getting educations in the ways that their parents had not.
We have another question asking about literacy rates. What do we know and how do we know it about literacy rates for Black folks in New York State?
So there is no way I'm ever going to be able to sort of answer that question in a super quantitative way.
Yeah.
What I
that was
probably not surprising. But yeah. I think that's again sort of in thinking about sort of where the research leads you. I think it was relatively high. I mean, I don't even know like what percentage I want to say, like 50, 60%. Like it's probably like I'm ballparking there, but it's I think higher than I would have assumed before I started researching the book, and before I had seen how many Black children and how many Black schools were just opening in places. And this is an example. I do sort of like a little micro study of a Black school that opened in Albany. And what we know, for example, if you look at census records, right? So this is Albany in like the 1810s, 1820s. I don't remember the exact figures. There actually are some numbers in the book, but let's say there's like, 300 children in Albany at that time period, and we can glean that from the federal census. So we know there's about 300 children, and there's like 150 people enrolled in the school, right? So there's in some cases you can actually tell, well, if there's this many children, this many in school, it's roughly, and I think it was actually higher than that. I think in Albany it was more something like 75% of the children were in school. So there are moments where we can sort of answer that question with some degree of precision. But the other, like the quick last thing I'd say about this is I think there's a number of reasons why the first Black newspaper gets published in New York in 1827, and that's the first Black newspaper nationwide. It's in New York. I don't think that's coincidental, because in part there was an audience that read, and it's a chicken and egg, right? And then it's like there's a newspaper, and so people are also incentivized to read things that are important to them. So it's I just think there's higher rates of literacy than I think many of us would have previously assumed.
Yeah.
And
I
you
would I
said,
just echo that by saying like people had an insatiable appetite for reading. Like then I mean, again, there's no TV. There's also all you had was like the Bible and the newspaper. You know what I mean? And so to have these like, especially when you get slave narratives, like Douglas's narrative, I mean, it sells like hotcakes. Like people just want to get their hands on literature and compelling literature at that.
I'm going to use this to segue into a question I wanted to ask. The early chapters, I think, do like some really important work on, especially, I think it's maybe the first, maybe the second chapter, in situating it within, we draw this sort of sharp line between like freedom and slavery. And I think for a lot of people, frankly, I mean, scholars kind of know this, but I think for a lot of people, there's less of an understanding that there's really a spectrum here, and you situate the debate about and make a big point of saying that, for folks that are, including a number of the folks who are white folks who are anti-slavery in this period, the whole question of emancipation is tied up with this question of like, well, what's going to become of these folks afterwards, right? This is your comment, your reference to poor law, right? The English poor laws, which sort of are such a huge framework for so much. I mean, not just law in the U.S., but in other countries as well, for this new population that's coming out of the, well, just to be simple about it, the general workings of modernity, right? So, and the question is like, well, who's going to, in this new sort of liberal order, who is going to provide the basic material resources for this population of people who in the past would have been living on, a feudal land or something. I think that it will be difficult for, I could say this as a person who used to be in the classroom. I think it would be difficult for most people to sort of understand that that was a huge context in which this debate took place, right? Because essentially, maybe I can reword this into English. Folks were afraid that if you emancipated all these people, then there'll be all these poor people that the state would then have to pay for.
Mm-hmm.
And so even some of these folks who were anti-slavery, right, were hesitant to sort of like go that distance, right? And then on the other side of it, like, there were all these, it was routine for parents, even white parents, right, to sort of like have their children sort of like loaned out as indentured servants, right? And this is the general context in which this is the world, right, that I think would be, I think that's something that's lost on a lot of people. So maybe, there's really not a question on that, but maybe you could just kind of riff on that a bit, and because I think it's important.
It's funny because I think historiographically, which is the fancy word historians use for like how do historians retell a story in new ways based on new evidence or reframe or reperiodize a story. I did really want to start with like early modern poor law. I'm kind of obsessed with early modern poor law, and for most people, like that's not a snazzy topic. But going back to in Elizabethan England, these like draconian, harsh poor laws get passed by Parliament. the colonists take them to the Americas, they put them into their own state laws. And so this is a time period, and there's been really good recent literature on this. A friend of mine, Kristen Obrasa-Colfin, wrote a book called Vagrants and Vagabonds, the ways in which poor people's labor is coerced in the colonial era and into the early republic, and in ways like poor children can be taken from their parents if the parents aren't quote unquote providing. And it's not, and this is one thing I hope I say really clear in the book, and I really try, is it's not the same as racialized inherited slavery.
Sure.
But there are similarities, right? Like you can take a child from his parents with just because the law says you can, and you can force that child to work.
Because there is not this sharp distinction between freedom and slavery
yes,
that we,
like there's a whole set. I mean, even think about this also just like the laws of household and coverture, right? Like husbands can compel the labor of their wives. Husbands can compel the labor of their children as fathers, right? All of these sorts of people's labor is being constantly compelled. Physical violence or quote unquote correction, they called it at law, is fair game, right? You can beat all of these people if you're the head of a household. And so I think that's where the sort of the binary between this, Peter, what you're getting, I think the binary between freedom and slavery like just doesn't work for the early modern, early republic period. And so these anti-slavery folks, some of the people who wrote the gradual abolition law, for them, there was nothing strange about saying, well, you're born free, and yet your labor can still be coerced. Like and they literally the laws, they're like a pauper. They're like, they say it, like they're like, we'll treat these children like pauper children, like poor children. And so there's this sort of early modern legal architecture that allows these children to still be sort of treated in ways that we would not today at all consider being free.
We have one last, I think we have time maybe for one last question, unless somebody else is crafty and gets in another question soon. And fittingly enough, it comes from a former Gotham Center guest, William Sorrell, who wrote an excellent book on the New York Colored Orphan Society. And William asks, were any of those children, did any of those children feature in the book or come up in your research?
I love that question. I think, William, we actually, I think, met like pre-pandemic, like an age ago, and maybe a talk at Columbia, if I'm remembering correctly where it was. But it's, thank you so much for being here. It's so nice to actually know, I know at least one person in this audience, and I know your work. And it's funny. I mean, in some ways, it's going to sound like a little bit of a dodge, but I didn't do, the Colored Orphan Asylum is in the book. Is in part not as much in the book because people like you have written like big, wonderful books on it. Leslie Harris wrote a bunch about it. And so some of it was also just having to sort of like pick and choose like what sort of to emphasize narratively. But I think the Colored Orphan Asylum, it comes up for me in a couple of important ways. One is James McCune Smith is one of the most sort of important characters in the book because, and for those in the audience who don't know, he goes to the African free school that I've mentioned. He is born to an enslaved mother in New York. So he's sort of born in this gradual abolition era. He's a member of the generation. He's brilliant. And he ends up getting a medical degree. He's the first Black man to earn an MD, although he has to go to Scotland to do it because med schools in the US won't take him because of his race. And then he comes back to New York after his medical degree. He opens a pharmacist. He's an abolitionist. He's an intellectual, a politician, but he's also a doctor in the Colored Orphan Asylum. And so in some ways, my way into the Colored Orphan Asylum was sort of thinking about this is yet one other way that a child of gradual abolition, and this goes back to, I think, some of the conversation we had with Kelly, is they're amazing. I mean, he's amazing in pursuing his own profession, but then he has such a sense of collective responsibility. And he's very clear about it, right? That like, he comes home. Like in some ways, it might have been better for him to stay in Scotland, right? He's like part of the Glasgow Anti-Slavery Society. Like it's, again, like we said, New York City is not always the easiest place to be. And I think he has a real sense of sort of obligation to his former classmates, to Black children in New York, to, you know, being a doctor and caring, you know, for families. When the Civil War starts, he's quite vocal about the fact that he doesn't think that Lincoln is moving fast enough on emancipation policy. He has some testy letters with Gerrit Smith, where Gerrit Smith, who had sort of been this pre-war radical, all of a sudden seems to have like cooled his jets a little bit, and James McCune Smith is pushing him. So I realize in some ways so the Colored Orphan Asylum sort of comes in through things like what James McCune Smith is doing. And then the last thing I want to say is then it comes in again in the Civil War draft riots. Which is sort of, and I think this goes back to Kelly's point about the mayor of New York during the Civil War actually talks about possibly seceding from the state and joining the Confederacy. New York City is a place, there are these terrible draft riots in 1863 where sort of anti-slavery businesses, Black institutions. The Colored Orphan Asylum gets attacked. And one of the things I was sort of actually, and I guess there's actually is one part in the book about the Colored Orphan Asylum and the aftermath of that had been less familiar to me before I started researching. After the Civil War draft riots, the New York Tribune, which is the largest circulated paper in the country, it's a Republican organ. It supports Lincoln. Sort of talks about all the ways in which Black New Yorkers were sort of horrifically attacked during the riots, but how much people came back and rebuilt, including the Colored Orphan Asylum, right? This goes back to, I think, the sort of the grit and resilience. And the Tribune sort of says stuff. They're like, look at, like, these people just faced the worst thing and they're still here. Some people leave for good, but a lot come back and they rebuild, and the Colored Orphan Asylum is rebuilt. And this always sort of touched me, newspapers actually list all of sort of the property and destruction of people who were attacked during the mobs. And one of the things I found was that it was one of the teachers of the Colored Orphan Asylum, a female teacher, I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head, was one of the people who's understandably, because she's part of the Colored Orphan Asylum, her property had been destroyed during the riots. And there's something about seeing sort of individual people's names and sort of like what they had lost in this attack, that I think brings something that can seem abstract sometimes, like it's this big riot, to like the specific individuals who were affected by this violence.
Well, Sarah, I want to join Kelly in saying congratulations on this book.
Yay.
It is.
We love it. We love
It's
it.
definitely worth.
Everyone get Kelly's book too. Right there.
Yes, you should all go out right now and
buy books.
Yes. and buy from the publisher, because Jeff Bezos has enough money.
Yes, that's very true too.
Pen Press. Kelly and I share the same editor and press. I'll mention. Yeah, so go buy on Pen Press website.
Yes. Pen Press. They're so great.
Bob Lockhart.
Yes.
Yes, big shout out to Bob, and congratulations again. Kelly, thanks so much for your fabulous presentation and questions.
My pleasure.
Best of luck to you and everything. Not that you need it. I hope to see you two soon, and I hope you
at the Pulitzer Prize ceremony, right, Sarah?
Yeah, exactly. We'll see you all at the awards.
Bye, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.